Evening settled over the prairie like a held breath, copper light thinning into violet as the sun slipped behind the far hills. The grasses bent low beneath the wind, weary pilgrims bowing toward night, their whispers threading through the air. Along the dirt road that wound away from town, a woman walked alone. Nakomi Greyhawk moved with the careful steadiness of someone who had learned how to carry pain without letting it show. She was tall, full-figured, her body strong despite the ache time had stitched into her joints. Each step pressed memory into the dust, not regret, memory, the kind that lived in the bones. Her skin, deep and warm as the earth itself, caught the last slant of light. Her hair, silver white and unbound, streamed behind her in the wind, shimmering like moon thread pulled loose from the loom of the sky. People in town said she wore it that way because she had stopped caring. In truth, she wore it loose because binding it reminded her of hands that were no longer there. The road was familiar. She had walked it for years, ever since grief had taught her that stillness invited too many thoughts. Walking gave her somewhere to put them. She passed the same split fence posts, the same low hills, the same stretch where the land opened wide and made a person feel small enough to breathe again. Behind her, the town murmured. It always did. They spoke her name softly, as if it were fragile or dangerous. Widow, apothecary, too proud, too old. They said she had outlived her place in the story, that she should be grateful for quiet and not ask the world for more. Nakomi heard them all. She had learned to hear without reacting, to let words pass through her like wind through tall grass. Still, some nights when the sky darkened just right, the old ache stirred. She had once believed in love with the kind of faith people reserve for law or gravity. She had loved fiercely, openly, with no thought for protection. And when that love had been taken from her, not faded, not failed, but torn away, she had learned a harder lesson. Love, she decided, was a fire that did not care who it consumed. Better to tend herbs, better to tend wounds, better to offer healing without offering her heart. Yet the prairie was an honest witness. It carried sound too far to hide from it. From the valley below came the lowing of cattle, a long, lonely sound that pressed against her chest. From the saloon drifted laughter, sharp, bright, careless, rising up the hill like smoke. Nakomi slowed her steps, annoyed at the tightness in her throat. She told herself she did not miss such things, that longing was a young woman's indulgence, that time had cured her of it. Still, her hand tightened around her shawl. And that was when the sound reached her. Hooves. Not hurried, not reckless, a steady, deliberate rhythm rolling across the earth like distant thunder. Nakomi stopped walking. The prairie seemed to hold still with her. Riders passed this way often, but something about this one demanded attention. The sound was too grounded, too certain. She turned slowly. The horizon broke open for him. He rode in from the west on a powerful stallion, horse and rider moving as one dark silhouette against the fading sky. He was a giant of a man, broad as canyon stone, shoulders squared against the open land. He sat his horse easily, reins loose, posture relaxed yet ready, as if the world had taught him to expect resistance and he had learned not to fear it. When he saw her, he slowed. The horse snorted softly, hooves settling into the dust. The man tipped his hat, not with flirtation, not with bravado, but with a quiet respect that startled her more than any boldness might have. Their eyes met. The moment was brief, barely a breath, yet something passed between them, an unfamiliar weight, like recognition without memory, like standing at the edge of a thought that refused to name itself. His gaze did not skim past her the way men's often did, nor did it linger with pity or appraisal. It held steady, searching, as though he were looking at a map he had somehow known before. Nakomi's pulse jumped, sharp and unwelcome. She broke eye contact at once, annoyed with herself. Men looked at her sometimes, some with cruelty, some with curiosity, some with the careless boldness of those who mistook her quiet for vacancy. This was different. This felt dangerous. She nodded once, stiff and polite, then turned back to the road. Her skirts brushed the grasses as she walked on, spine straight, pace measured. She did not look back. Behind her, the man remained still, watching as she moved away, her silver hair bright against the darkening land. Something inside him shifted, deep, instinctive, undeniable. He had crossed plains and years with a restlessness he could never name. Now, for the first time, it had a shape. He did not follow, not yet. Nokomi reached the edge of town as the first stars pricked the sky. Her apothecary waited, small and square, oil lamp glowing faintly through the window. As she opened the door, the familiar scents of dried sage and lavender wrapped around her like habit. She set her basket down and lit another lamp, hands steady by long practice. Yet her thoughts betrayed her, straying back to the road, to the rider's gaze, to the strange echo it had left behind. She frowned at herself, sharp and unforgiving. "I'm too old for love," she said aloud to the quiet room, as if the words were a rule that needed repeating, as if saying them might make them true. Outside, the prairie wind moved on, carrying with it the promise of something approaching, slow, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. The bell above the apothecary door chimed once, softly, the way it always did. It was an ordinary sound, so familiar that Nokomi Greyhawk nearly ignored it. Nearly. Something in the air shifted. The scent of rain crept in first, sharp and clean, carried on leather and wind. When she looked up from the counter, he stood in her doorway, hat in hand, rain-darkened coat clinging to his broad frame. He filled the room without effort. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The oil lamp flickered between them, throwing slow shadows across shelves lined with jars and bundles of dried herbs. Outside, thunder rolled low and distant. His hand was bleeding. A deep cut split his palm, red against weathered skin, blood seeping into the dust that clung to him from the trail. He lifted it slightly, not demanding, not apologetic, simply presenting a fact. Nokomi gestured to the chair by the table. "Sit," she said, her voice calm, practiced, betraying nothing. Men came to her shop often, ranch hands with split knuckles, riders with rope burns, women with aching joints and quiet grief. This should have been no different. Yet her heart knew better. He sat carefully, as though mindful of the space, of her, of the smallness of the room compared to him. She noticed the way he removed his hat and set it aside, the way he kept his injured hand still, not clenching against pain, a man accustomed to bearing things without complaint. She cleaned the cut with steady fingers, her touch professional, precise. The sting drew no reaction from him. He did not flinch, he did not curse, he did not look away. Instead, he watched her, not her hands, her face. His gaze was unsettling, not because it was bold, but because it was unwavering, as if each line time had written into her skin mattered, as if the silver threaded through her hair was not something to overlook, but something to read. Nokomi focused harder on her work, on the rhythm of mending, on the thread drawn through skin, the familiar ritual of closing what had been opened. Yet she felt his attention like pressure at her back, steady and unrelenting. Silence gathered between them. It was not empty, it was thick with things unsaid, with questions neither dared voice. The lamp crackled softly. Rain tapped the window. Her breath slowed to keep pace with her hands. When she finished, she wrapped his palm carefully and stepped back. Only then did he speak. "Thank you." 2 words, nothing more. His voice was low, grounded, carrying the weight of someone who chose words carefully because he did not waste them. The sound of it settled in her chest and stayed there, unwelcome and warm. She nodded once, curt, already turning away to clean her tools. "Keep it dry," change the bandage in 2 days. He stood, towering again, and replaced his hat. For a moment, it seemed as though he might say something more. Instead, he hesitated, then inclined his head, a gesture of respect rather than farewell, and left. The bell chimed again. When the door closed, the quiet he took with him felt louder than the thunder outside. Nokomi stood very still, her hands resting on the edge of the table. She waited for the strange tension in her chest to pass. It did not. She told herself it was nothing, that she was reacting to disruption, not to him, that solitude sharpened the senses and made ordinary encounters feel larger than they were. Still, she found herself staring at the door long after the rain faded. The next morning, she opened her shop as she always did. Sunlight spilled across the porch, pale and clean after the storm. The prairie smelled of damp earth and new beginnings she refused to acknowledge. She stepped outside to sweep and stopped short. Wildflowers lay across her porch step. Not arranged, not tied, simply gathered, stems damp with dew, colors soft and living against the worn wood. She knelt slowly, touching them as if they might vanish under her fingers. No note, no explanation. Her first instinct was irritation, a courtesy, she decided, a man repaying kindness in the only language he knew. She brought them inside and set them in a jar, telling herself she would discard them by evening. She did not. 2 days later he returned, not for his hand, which was healing well, but with another small bundle of flowers, and again after that, always silent, always respectful, never lingering longer than necessary. With each visit, she felt something shift inside her, a quickening she resented, a warmth she told herself was foolish. She began setting aside extra salve, extra herbs, things he never asked for, but which gave her reason to press them into his calloused hand. When he accepted them, his eyes softened with something she refused to name. Was this charity, or was something far more dangerous unfolding? At night, Nokomi lay awake listening to the wind, to the distant sounds of cattle and laughter, and wondered when she had begun listening for hooves. She scolded herself for the thought. Love, she reminded herself, was a fire she had already survived once. And yet, somewhere, deep beneath years of restraint, an ember stirred, quiet, persistent, and unwilling to be extinguished.
The town noticed everything. It noticed when Colt McGraw's horse began appearing regularly outside the apothecary. It noticed when repairs around Nokomi Greyhawk's shop quietly finished themselves, loose boards mended, a sagging step made level. The fence around her herb garden straightened without a word exchanged. It noticed the wildflowers, fresh and unannounced, appearing like a ritual. And the town talked. In the saloon, whispers slithered between tables like smoke, curling around spilled whiskey and crooked smiles. Men leaned close to one another, voices low, eyes sharp. "She's too old for him," someone muttered, laughter thick with cruelty. "Winter widow clinging to spring," another sneered. The words were meant to sting, and they did. Even when spoken out of her presence, they found her. Words always did. Nokomi heard them when she stepped into the saloon that evening, the room briefly quieting before conversation resumed. She kept her chin high, her pace steady, refusing to show the way her chest tightened. She had come for supplies, nothing more, yet every glance felt weighted, every murmur sharpened. She reminded herself that she had survived worse than gossip, that she had buried a husband, that she had buried dreams. What were whispers compared to that? Still, they cut. She caught her reflection in the darkened mirror behind the bar, silver hair loose at her shoulders, lines at the corners of her eyes deepened by years of restraint. She thought of the braids she no longer wore, of the mirror at home she avoided when the lamplight was unkind. She left without finishing her errand. Outside, the night air was cool, the sky wide and indifferent. She walked until the saloon's laughter faded, until only the sound of the river reached her.
Moonlight spilled across the water, turning it silver, restless and honest. She stood at the bank, arms wrapped around herself, and spoke to the current as if it were an old friend who knew her secrets. "I'm too old," she said quietly, "too worn, too late." The words tasted bitter, as though they had teeth. Saying them aloud made them feel heavier, more final. She swallowed hard, blinking against the sting in her eyes. Behind her, footsteps crunched softly on gravel. She did not turn. "Go," she said, voice tight. "Please." Colt McGraw stopped a few paces away. He did not argue. He did not ask questions. He did not tell her she was wrong. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, and laid his coat around her shoulders. The weight of it startled her, warm, solid, carrying the faint scent of leather and rain. Then he stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the quiet steadiness of him, yet careful not to crowd. They faced the river together. Minutes passed. The water murmured. The wind lifted her hair and pressed it against his coat. She waited for him to speak, to defend, to persuade. He did not. His silence was not absence. It was presence, deep and unyielding. It said, "I am here. I am not afraid of this moment. I will not leave because you push." When she finally turned to him, her breath caught. There was no pity in his eyes, no indulgence, no calculation, only a fierce tenderness that unsettled her more than mockery ever had, as if he saw her exactly as she was, her years, her body, her guarded heart, and found nothing lacking. "What could I give you?" she asked, the question breaking free before she could stop it. "Your life is still stretching wide ahead of you." He did not answer with words. He reached for her hands, steadying them when they trembled, and held them as if they belonged there, as if this was the simplest truth in the world. In that quiet, something shifted, not resolved, not healed, but seen. They walked back towards town together, not touching, not speaking, yet no longer apart. At the steps to her shop she paused. "This can't be," she said softly, not as a plea, as a warning. Colt inclined his head once, acknowledging the boundary. He did not cross it. He simply said, "I know," and turned away. Days bled into weeks. Nakomi caught herself humming as she swept the shop floor. She caught herself wearing her late mother's turquoise earrings again, their cool weight against her skin, both comfort and challenge. She caught herself listening for hooves. Colt fixed what was broken, always without asking, always without expectation. A fence mended, a shutter secured, a step that had sagged for years finally made safe. He was always gone before she could thank him properly. When he taught her to ride again, laughter startled her from her own throat, rusty but real. She nearly lost her balance, and his hand steadied her without lingering, without claiming. These were not grand gestures. They were offerings, small, steady, brick by brick. Nakomi told herself she was not foolish, that she was simply grateful for kindness, yet the question lingered, insistent as the river's song. Was love truly a wildfire meant only for the young, or was it something else entirely, an ember, slow and stubborn, refusing to fade no matter how long the night? The town kept whispering, but for the first time in years, Nakomi found that the whispers were no longer the loudest voice she heard. The storm came without warning, as if the prairie itself had grown impatient with restraint. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened to a bruised gray, clouds piling high and heavy over the hills. The wind shifted, sharp and restless, rattling the shutters of Nakomi Greyhawk's apothecary. She felt it in her bones before the first drop fell, the coming violence, the kind that did not ask permission. Rain struck hard and fast, drumming against the windows, turning the dirt road outside into a river of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, so close it shook the shelves and set the jars humming against one another. Nakomi moved quickly, securing shutters, steady despite the way her heart thudded in her chest. Storms had always unsettled her, not from fear of thunder, but from memory. Loss had come on a night like this once, sudden, merciless, loud enough to drown prayer. She told herself she was past such things, yet her hands trembled as she latched the final window. That was when the door burst open. Wind and rain rushed in first, wild and cold, followed by Colt McGraw, soaked through, chest heaving as if he had ridden hard against both distance and doubt. Water streamed from his coat and hat, pooling on the floor, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. For a long moment he did not speak, neither did she. The storm roared around them, thunder shaking the walls, lightning flashing through the cracks in the shutters. The oil lamp flickered, casting their shadows large and wavering against the walls, as if the room itself were holding its breath. Colt closed the door behind him and removed his hat. Then, without ceremony, without flourish, he crossed the room and dropped to one knee before her. The motion stunned her, not because it was dramatic, but because it was deliberate, as if he had chosen this posture long before the storm forced his hand, as if the earth itself had pressed him down, demanding honesty. He took her hands, weathered, strong, hands that had healed countless others, and pressed them flat against his chest. Beneath her palms, his heart thundered, fast and unrelenting, a living echo of the storm outside. Still, he said nothing. The silence spoke for him. Here I am. Here I remain. Here I choose you. Her breath hitched, sharp and sudden, as if something long locked inside her had found the key. Tears rose before she could stop them, blurring the edges of the room, the years, the careful walls she had built around herself. She pulled her hands back, shaking her head, panic and longing colliding in her chest. "You shouldn't," she whispered, the words breaking apart as they left her mouth. "I'm too old. I'm too—" Her voice cracked. She turned away, pressing her hand to her mouth, as the truth she had sworn never to speak aloud clawed its way free. "I'm too late," she said. "I missed my chance. The world already took what was mine." The words tasted like surrender. Behind her, she felt him rise, felt his presence before she felt his touch. He did not correct her. He did not argue her fears away. Instead, he wrapped his arms around her from behind, slow and careful, as though asking permission with every inch of movement. His embrace was firm, grounding, sheltering her against both storm and memory. She felt the heat of him, the steadiness, the simple fact of another human being choosing to stand with her in her unraveling. She sobbed then, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet release of someone who had carried too much alone for too long. Years poured out of her in those tears, the loss, the restraint, the discipline of loneliness she had mistaken for strength. Colt held her without tightening, without urgency. He did not rush her grief. He honored it. When her breathing finally slowed, she turned in his arms and looked up at him, searching his face for the pity she feared. It was not there. What she found instead was resolve. Not the loud kind, not the kind that needed witnesses, but a fierce tenderness, steady and unyielding, that unsettled her more than cruelty ever could. As if he saw every scar, every line, every year she believed disqualified her, and counted them as proof, not flaw. "I don't want your youth," he said at last, his voice low, measured, carrying through the roar of the storm. "I want you." The simplicity of it struck her harder than any vow. Outside, thunder split the sky again, rain lashing the windows as if trying to break through. Inside, something else gave way. Not her caution, her fear. She rested her forehead against his chest, listening to his heart, no longer frantic, but sure. For the first time in years, she did not feel like she was bracing for loss. She felt present, seen, chosen. The storm raged on, violent and unrestrained. But within the small circle of lamplight, Nokomi Greyhawk stood held and unashamed, finally understanding that the years had not disqualified her for love. They had prepared her for it. And when the thunder rolled away into the distance, leaving only rain and quiet, she knew, without doubt, that she would never again mistake safety for solitude, or fear for wisdom. The storm had not come to destroy her. It had come to break her open.
The morning Nokomi Greyhawk woke knowing she would marry Colt McGraw, there were no trumpets of certainty, no sudden rush of girlish excitement. There was only peace. It surprised her how steady she felt. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of her bedroom, pale and forgiving, touching the familiar room where she had spent so many years alone. The mirror across from her reflected a woman she had avoided studying too closely for a long time. Silver hair framed her face, her skin rich and deep, her body full with the marks of time lived honestly. She did not look away. Instead, she reached for her late mother's turquoise earrings, the stones cool against her palms. She had not worn them for years, not because they no longer suited her, but because they reminded her of a woman who had loved fiercely and without apology. Today, she fastened them in place with calm resolve. This was not a wedding born of haste. It was the quiet culmination of many small moments. After the storm, nothing between her and Colt rushed forward. There were no grand declarations shouted across town, no defiance meant to silence whispers. Instead, there were mornings when he brought coffee and left before she woke. Afternoons spent tending her garden together, their shoulders brushing as they worked the soil. Evenings where they sat on her porch, saying little, listening to the prairie breathe. The town watched, confused by the lack of spectacle. They expected scandal. They expected embarrassment. They expected her to shrink under their scrutiny. She did not. When the rumors returned, because they always did, she found they no longer cut the same way. Shame had loosened its grip. What replaced it was not arrogance, but clarity. She was not asking permission anymore. Colt never defended her loudly. He did not confront men in the saloon or demand respect through force. Instead, he stood with her, helped her carry water, walked beside her to town, let his presence say what words never could. Love, she realized, was not a wildfire. It was embers, steady, patient, enduring. They wed quietly at the edge of the prairie, beneath an open sky that made no distinctions about age or worth. A few witnesses stood nearby, people who mattered. No banners, no music, no spectacle meant to convince anyone but themselves. Nokomi wore a simple dress, soft and unadorned, the fabric resting easily against her body. She did not hide her arms. She did not bind her hair. The wind moved through it freely, silver bright against the blue. Colt stood before her, impossibly large and yet gentle in a way that still startled her. When he took her hands, his grip was firm, reverent, as though he understood exactly what they held: years of labor, healing, restraint, and survival. Their vows were spoken softly, not promises of rescue, not dreams of reclaiming youth, only choice. When he kissed her, it was not for the crowd. It was for the woman who had finally believed she was too late to be chosen. Afterward, there was no feast, no dancing, only shared bread, quiet laughter, and the deep satisfaction of something settled into place. That evening, as the sun lowered itself into gold, Nokomi stood before the mirror once more. Colt stood behind her, their reflections joined. She studied her hair, the lines at her eyes, the fullness of her body, the evidence of years lived fully and painfully. For the first time, she did not see loss. She saw survival. She saw beauty shaped by endurance. She saw a woman who had not been spared life, but had met it and remained standing. Colt did not speak. He did not need to. His presence beside her was answer enough.
Later, as they sat on the porch and watched the prairie darken, Nakomi rested her head against his shoulder. The land stretched wide before them, unchanged and honest. "I used to think love passed me by," she said quietly. Colt did not look down at her. He kept his eyes on the horizon. "I think it was just taken the long way," he replied. She smiled then, not the careful smile she offered the world, but the one she had guarded for years, the one that reached her eyes, the one that belonged to her. The wind carried the distant lowing of cattle across the valley. Somewhere far off, laughter rose from the saloon, just as it always had, but it no longer tugged at her chest with longing. She was no longer standing outside of life. She was inside it. If ever someone were to ask her what love looked like at her age, she would not speak of fire or fate. She would speak of quiet mornings, of hands that stayed, of fear released, not erased. And if ever you find yourself believing that love has already passed you by, remember a silver-haired woman beneath an open sky and the giant cowboy who knelt without needing words. Because love is not bound by youth. It is bound by courage. And sometimes the storm you think has already passed is only waiting at the horizon, riding toward you, patient and unafraid, ready to be met at last.